Well, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us today. This is a very, very traumatizing and sad day where we have learned the news and seen some of the footage that was taken from the shooting and the killing of the well-known and highly regarded Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. And I worked for Al Jazeera for many years. Shireen was, of course, a great fixture of the channel. And I know her colleagues at Al Jazeera are feeling this very, very hard today, as are correspondents right across the region who have known and worked for her. But we're joined by our great friend Ramzy, Palestinian author and also founding editor of the Palestine Chronicle. Ramzy, of course, you knew her too. And I wondered if before we sort of embark on what needs to happen now, if you have some personal memories you could share with us.
Thank you very much for having me on the program again, Mark, and for shedding light on this extremely important and critical issue. The thing about Shireen is that, as you said, she was just one of those people at Al Jazeera that kind of defined Al Jazeera's narrative in Palestine, and certainly has been one of the best journalists across the Middle East. And one thing that I appreciated so much about her, aside from her humble demeanor and just kindness, she was a very kind and gentle person, is the type of journalism that she did in Palestine is what we call community journalism. She wasn't this kind of foreign journalist, chasing after scoops and such. She tried to engage ordinary people into her reporting. She spoke to old ladies in the streets. She would sit with people in coffee shops and talk to them. She spoke to children. She spoke to human rights activists, and she talked to civil society organizers, and she was always there. She was always there at the front line, and she was extremely courageous in the way she did this. We kind of took it for granted. I mean, she's been doing it for such a long time, and she was there throughout the entire second Palestinian Intifada. And when Shireen Abu Akleh comes on television, you kind of know that everybody has to be quiet, because whatever she says is going to be as close to the truth on what is happening and the reality that's happening in Palestine. So when I woke up this morning and a colleague tells me that a Palestinian journalist, Al Jazeera journalist, was killed, I mean, two things. Number one, as a Palestinian journalist myself, I know many journalists on the ground, so there is always this, sense of, immediacy and urgency. Who is it? Because you are gonna. There's a very good chance you're gonna know that person, personally, or worked with him or her. But then when he said it's Al Jazeera journalist, as someone who has worked for Al Jazeera for years as well, that was particularly frightening. And then when the name was Shireen Abu Akleh, I just could not believe it. This person, this incredible journalist, why would she be murdered in cold blood in such a way? Not that anybody deserved to be killed, but Shireen was very well known to Israeli soldiers in that area. She's been working there for over 20 years, and they must have known who she was when they actually opened fire and killed her. In fact, many people are using the term assassination. I would use the same term as well, because the nature of her death was, this is not just a random fire. When you get shot in the head as a journalist, while you are fully wearing, your press vest
Well,
and your
this is it, Ramzy. If her colleagues saw her put on the vest which said press. She wore a helmet. Everybody knows what a journalist wears in these situations, and clearly she became a target.
Right.
Now, of course, we have also learned today that the Israelis are denying, the Israeli government are denying that any one of their soldiers shot Shireen. They're claiming that she was killed by Palestinians involved in a firefight with the Israelis. But there is no evidence that's been offered by the Israelis to support this. And so far, her colleagues, Shireen's colleagues who are there, have disputed the Israeli claims. Now, I think it's worth just pointing out that, of course, that as many of you know, as Ramzy knows, of course, as well, Shireen was an American and Palestinian citizen. So this actually does put the ball very much in the court of the United States as well. This is not just another case of yet another journalist, by the way, because there have been so many who have been injured and killed by the Israeli forces. This is a case of somebody who's also their citizen. And just before we come back to Ramzy, we do have a clip, and this is from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the Michigan Congresswoman, who spoke earlier today on Hearing the News.
Madam Speaker, earlier we heard our president at the White House Correspondents say something very powerful that I want to share in this chamber. President Biden said, "We honor journalists killed, missing, imprisoned, detained, and tortured, covering war, exposing corruption, and holding leaders accountable." He further said that the free press is not the enemy of people. Far from it. At your best, he told the journalist, you are the guardians of the truth. So today, I would like, as folks woke up this morning all across the world, people woke up to the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. And I would like to do a moment of silence as we heard the shocking news of this journalist of over 20 years, a Palestinian American, killed. So please, a moment of silence.
Well, that's very powerful. Sadly, you could see from the footage there briefly, there were not all that many congressmen and women there to heed that call, but those who were did. Now, the thing is, as you know, Ramzy, this is Shireen's killing today has followed on from a whole succession of killings and of injuries. And we had of course, people forget because it happens so frequently, the claims that the Associated Press building was deliberately attacked by the Israelis, killing journalists. I beg your pardon, destroying Associated Press, but also affecting other news journalists outlets in the same building, quite deliberately targeted that building. In recent days, we've seen journalists who have been attacked outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque videoed, it's been recorded, journalists who have been covering the planned removal of Palestinians and their villages from the Negev. Also, this has gone on and on and on. You know, of course, Palestinians themselves suffer this, civilians suffer this too. There have been 25 Palestinians who've been killed in recent days in some of these military operations. The violence in Palestine, Israel is spreading, and journalists are now being targeted. What really must now happen, Ramzy?
Thank you for that, Mark. But I think it's important that we make it very, very clear here is that when you have these kind of numbers, when the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate, for example, says annually anywhere between 500 to 700 Palestinian journalists or journalists in Palestine are targeted by the Israeli occupation, and that nearly 50 of them have been killed since the Second Intifada in 2000. So we are not talking about random incidents here. We're not talking about journalists being in the crossfire. We are talking about a targeted Israeli campaign that aims at silencing journalists, because journalists means people who are there reporting and conveying the truth on what is happening in Palestine. That's one thing. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, if journalists are being mistreated in such a way, beaten, arrested, humiliated, killed, deported, and so on. Imagine what would the plight of civilians be. I mean, these are the people that, you know, when a journalist is killed, is going to make international news. But and yet Israel does it without any problem, with impunity, and without any fear of accountability whatsoever. Imagine the plight of ordinary Palestinian civilians. So this is something that's very important. I think we need to keep in mind. The third point we need to keep in mind, sadly, just because Shireen Abu Akleh is an American citizen as well, I think there's going to be a lot of lip service paid to this issue, demands for investigations, but at the end of the day, there will be no accountability. That is the tragic truth. She will not be the first Palestinian who was arrested. There are American Palestinians who are in prison right now as we speak. And yet the State Department, the White House, the American government, and the American embassy in Israel have done absolutely nothing regarding these individuals. So I think there is a little bit more attention because of her dual citizenship. But on the other hand, I don't think it's going to translate to anything practical. And this is why we need to keep pushing. And that's back to your question regarding what needs to happen. Civil society needs to get involved. Human rights organizations needs to get involved. They need to raise their voices in tandem and say, this is enough. We need accountability. The murderers have to be held accountable, if not according to Israeli law, which we know will not happen, at least according to international law. And this
Ramzy,
is very urgent because their
if I
life
may
is on the
come
line.
in there, I mean, we know that the International Criminal Court, there are investigators already on the ground in Ukraine, recording alleged war crimes against civilians, moving very, very quickly. And of course, had this been a journalist that had been murdered by Russian forces in Ukraine, we can just imagine the outcry across the world for this. There is, of course, an outcry over the killing of Shireen, but as you say, there is a fear that this could just be papered over, some condemnation perhaps, but then people move on. But do you not just think that there could just be a tipping point because global opinion is looking much more intensely now at what's going on in Palestine and comparing it to also what's going on in Ukraine?
That's right. I think we are indeed on the verge of that tipping point. But the question is, what are the channels that are going to help us achieve that tipping point? We have been talking about the current is changing, and that there is a critical mass that is being built, and there's a tipping point. It's all true, and it's not a fantasy. But the question is, will this justice come from the European Union? Will it come from the White House? Will it come from these official channels that have supported Israel for all of these years? The technology that is used to kill Palestinians comes from these very governments. So I greatly doubt, that justice will also come from the very entities that provide the weapons to Israel. But the tipping point would have to happen through ordinary people, civil society organizations, human rights organizations which have been speaking out, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, even Israeli human rights organizations such as B'Tselem. They have been speaking out, and they have been exposing the murderous nature of this Israeli apartheid. We need to invest more on that, and we need to build on that with the hope that that tipping point is going to arrive, and hopefully soon.
Thank you, Ramzy. And finally, we've seen a big pushback in recent years in countries such as Germany and also here in the UK against the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. I wonder now, given what we've seen in recent weeks around al-Aqsa, around the killing of journalists, and more recently in Gaza, this constant attrition, and whether it's being ordered from on high against Palestinian civilians and those who are, as journalists, as we are and have been journalists, doing our job, being targeted. I wonder if actually, as a result of all of this, perhaps people get more emboldened and there's a pushback against those governments. And they say, well, it's not just boycott, divest and sanctions. It is sanctions, direct sanctions, as you were saying just then, Ramzy, against the military companies who are supplying the Israeli army with these weapons.
That's right. And it has to be, because what is the alternative? In the case of Ukraine, the likes of Joseph Borrell and others are talking about sending lethal weapons, that only war is the answer. But when it comes to the Palestinians, if Palestinians resist using armed resistance, they are terrorists. If they throw rockets at Israel in self-defense, they are saying they are instigating Israeli responses. But if they also use popular resistance, boycott tactics, they are also being called something else. They are anti-Semitic. They are motivated by their hate for Israel. Okay, but what do you have to say about journalists? Even journalists do not have safe space in this discourse. Can we at least agree that journalists should be respected, should be honored, should be given the space to do their work? The likes of Shireen Abu Akleh, which has done an incredible job over the last 20 years or so. This should be the reward after all of this hard work is just murder in broad daylight. So at least let's agree that this is a red line that cannot be crossed, and then build on that. Build on that. The journalists have the right to do their work, and they have the right to expose whatever crimes that are happening, and let audiences around the world make the decision if they are doing a good job or a bad job. And let's build on that. Let's build on that movement. BDS should not only should be sanctioned and should be legalized and allowed to operate in a normal environment, because it's a non-violent movement that is based on free choice, but it should actually be given much bigger platforms, as opposed to being criminalized as it has been in the United States, in France, in Canada, and many other countries. Because at this point, frankly, we Palestinians are being suffocated entirely. I'm not only talking about the hypocrisy regarding Ukraine and all of that. We have been suffocated for so many years. We have no space of self-expression whatsoever. Even our journalists, in the eyes of the Israeli soldiers, are criminals who deserve to be killed, arrested, beaten, humiliated, and deported. And that cannot stand. There has to be an outcry. There has to be an international outcry in order for this injustice to stop.
Thank you, Ramzy. And I think it really is a case of shooting the messenger. Today, this terrible day, when we learned the news of the killing of Shireen, a journalist who went to report for 30, 40 odd years, has been there on the West Bank and the occupied territories throughout Palestine, reporting dispassionately and fairly. And that's why she carried this respect of all her colleagues. She was a Palestinian, but she reported dispassionately. And she has paid for this, for simply doing her job with her life. So we respect her, and we commemorate her, and we send our deep commiserations to her family. But I'll leave the last word to you, Ramzy, because you knew her.
Thank you, Mark. I want to say that, Shireen Abu Akleh was an incredible journalist. She was a colleague. She was a friend of so many people who knew and loved her. But we also know that we also have the potential of many Shireen Abu Aklehs. They are the voice of the Palestinian people. I saw an article today published saying that in some newspaper that says she was the voice of the voiceless. Palestinians are not voiceless. And Shireen Abu Akleh was herself a Palestinian, and she was the voice of her people, as opposed to the voice of the voiceless. And there will be many Shireen Abu Aklehs. They are all over Al-Aqsa, they're all over Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Gaza. And there will always be another Shireen Abu Akleh who will carry the torch and will continue on with that mission and will continue on with this legacy until the Palestinian people receive their freedom and justice at long last.
Thank you very much, Ramzy. And on this sad day, thank you all for joining us, and let's hope that we meet again and with Ramzy in slightly more happier times. Thank you.
Thank you.